Oh, hello, hello. Good morning, evening, afternoon, guys. Welcome to Fine Print, a show here on the Verses, where we basically take a look at a poem that you send to us that has already been published, and then we just analyze it. This is not critique. This is more just kind of getting an idea of a reader's first impression through the work. These are poems I have not looked at extensively because I kind of want to get that fresh perspective so we can go through the journey together. Now, like I said, it's together. So as we read this poem, whether you're with me live now or you're watching at some point in the future, hello from the past. Let us know your thoughts on things. You can be like, Jeff, you're wrong. You'll be like, Jeff, that's so true. Whatever you're feeling or things that you think I missed, all of that is fair game. We'd love to hear it. This week's poem, let's take a quick look at, just kind of show off what we have here. And as this is loading too, if you want to send us a poem, the way to send us a poem is to actually, the easiest way is to find us on social media. On most social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram. Our big one is Threads. You can find us at the Verses. And once you're there, you can just send us a message. Or if that's not suitable for you, I know different people have different stances on social media things. I get it. So what you can do in that case is you can also, for instance, go over to our website, which I can actually show you. It's just launched, so we're really excited about that. It launched with our first issue, tree.com. This actually is not our homepage. This is the page for the journal. But regardless, what you'll see down at the bottom, if you'll scroll down, 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 maybe not on this page. Tab, versuspoetry.com. There is a tab where you can contact us. Second load down here at the bottom. You can at least just send us a message there. If you're not able to actually format the poem, I'll respond to you, and then from that you can send us an email and like send it as a PDF, as a link to the where it was published. If you do not have a poem published, but you want some feedback on it, maybe before you get it published, in that case, and you're interested in making radical revisions, I know some people are afraid, like, oh no, it's published online, I can't publish anywhere else. What I would say is, one, I don't count those revision poems. I don't consider them published on our end. So if you make some responsible radical revisions, I won't mention that we saw the poem first. But that all kind of comes down to how you want to play things. But if you make some radical revisions, who's to say? But anyways, those are some things in case you want to get some poems to us. But I lied to you because I said that I was going to show you a poem. So let's look at the poem that we're going to be taking a look at today. This is from the journal Breakwall. It's a journal I'm not familiar with, which is cool. Cuyahoga. So we're talking right around Cleveland, right? If we have any Ohio people, I am based in Ohio now, not originally from here. But our poem that we're going to be looking at is over here on page 12 by Colleen East. Congratulations on the publication. That's always good news. Like to hear that. And other things as well. And they have several poems actually in this collection, so feel free to check out those too. You can find those on the table of contents, but we're going to be focusing on this one entitled Dear to Dirt. Interesting title. I like their formatting, very, very clean. I'm guessing Garamond. I'm kind of waging a war against Garamond. I'm trying to be like, because I feel like every journal, like every poet's using Garamond now, and I'm like, it's tired of like, oh look, it's Garamond. Oh look, it's Garamond. And Garamond can just make like any poem look good. So I'm exploring different fonts. Let us know what your favorite font choices are when you're submitting things. If you're Team Garamond too, that's okay. Let's take a look at this again. This is the poem Dear to Dirt. Let's just do a quick read. My neighbor shot a deer and sought to hang its antlers. The head sat in a wheelbarrow by the fence and stank in a way that made the dogs howl. And rot it sat for weeks, enthroned in darkened soil. It stared through the fence at a world that stood idle while dead like me crept by. Then the skull was gone, perhaps taken by heaven. Then the wheelbarrow, perhaps taken for work, some fruitful garden. All that's left is the dirt. Thanks again to Colleen East for submitting this work. Excited to dive into it. Start with the title. Always going to start with titles. Actually, maybe even before we get to that, let's just kind of look at the poem visually. I always like to kind of just give it the eye test, kind of see what's going on here. So let's kind of just zoom out a little bit, look at the poem from distance a little bit. Okay, so what are some things when you're looking at the poem from far away? What are some things you're noticing in terms of the movement? Not even worried too much about the words. Okay, so we're starting off heavy. First 3 lines, your longest 3 lines. And we're finishing short. That last line, I wouldn't be surprised if when that last line was written, originally it went the whole distance, probably like dragged over here, and then they're like, let's split it. Just an interesting decision there. But your shortest lines down at the end, which could reinforce the form. Dear to dirt has that sense of like ash to ash, dust to dust kind of feel. I'm with that. So towards the end, you have like a very full life at the beginning, and then towards the end it kind of just disappears, so it has that kind of fading aspect. I could see that. I think the form works. It's a block. We don't have any stanzas, so it's one stanza. I mean, what does that do? So that also kind of falls back on that sense of cyclicalness. Everything's together, the life and the death, it's all contained in a single space. So I think that can also work well. Interesting with the first 3 lines just being so noticeably long, so much noticeably longer than everything that comes after it, because everything else here feels very consistent. So we'll have to see what we kind of make of that. My first guess is that when life first starts, it's a lot of energy, it's full, and then like the majority of our life is spent just kind of in adulthood, hopefully. and then your life is kind of creeps up on you. So those are just really rapid thoughts. You'd be like, Jeff, what do you want? But those are the things that are kind of just standing out to me right now. Let's zoom in a little bit more to kind of get more into the title and things like that. So, Dear to Dirt, again, I mentioned again, ash to ash, dust to dust, something living, something not living. The last, but also the similarities between it, right? Because Dear Dirt sharing so much. You have the D and the R sound. You have this the multiple vowel, but the single vowel sound versus the single vowel sound for dirt. So again, it kind of implies that sense of oneness, where that everything's kind of unified. I think that comes through by having those similarities there. This connection between kind of the living, the animal, and the dead. Into the poem itself. My neighbor shot a deer. It's a really I like that intro. Really interesting because that would have been an interesting place for the line break, because it would have fit. If the line had ended there, it would have fit everything else after it. So super intentional to be like, no, we're going to drag this line out. Very interesting. Oh, look who's here. Look who decided to show up. The Dream Slunker, our poet of the poem. That's what's up. Glad you can make it. You can listen to all my thoughts and tell me how wrong and far away from the truth I am. So I am kind of curious. You can let me know if you're here. If you want to reveal. If you don't want to reveal, that's fine. I'm curious. Did you play around with this first line, deciding, hey, we're going to end it on deer, or we're going to extend it to antlers? Because I think the line lengths, and especially in these first 3 lines, are really interesting. And they're just that's what's up. Neighbor shot a deer and sought to hang its antlers. Again, very, very intriguing opening. I'm grounded. I'm with you. Sometimes poems start and I'm like, I have no idea where I am. I don't know if I'm going to make it through the piece, but I'm very grounded here. I'm intrigued. I think the first part has a lot of energy to it, just with the shot. You know, it's a very violent act. And then the second part, there's a kind of a sense of weirdness. I was in a workshop with Ivy Francis, and one of the things she says that every poem needs something weird. And it's not necessarily weird to hang the antlers. I think the thought, you know, it's not just my neighbor shot a deer and hung its antlers. It's like, no, thought. There's a sense of failure. There's a sense I wasn't able to do the thing I wanted to do. So I think thought is doing a lot of work there. They mentioned they left it long to contrast with how short the last lines were. And that's, if you play back to what we're talking about at the beginning, I think that's something that we kind of discussed. So that makes a lot of sense. Sought to hang its antlers. Sought again, like I mentioned, doing a lot of work. We don't know why sought. Why didn't it actually happen? We wanted it to happen, but it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Or for that neighbor, why wasn't the neighbor able to do it? Can kind of continue with that weirdness. The head sat in a wheelbarrow by the fence. That's weird. Just a deer head hanging out in a wheelbarrow. I'm not from the country. I'm from a city. We don't do this. But I think even a lot of people in the country don't necessarily do this. And stank in a way that made the dogs howl. That's such a great image too, in the sense of stank in a way that made the dogs howl. Because you don't usually, a lot of times when I think of dogs howling, a lot of times I feel like it's based on visuals or it's based on sound. So then to pair the dog howling with a different sense, you're pairing the dog howling with your olfactory, with your smell. I think that sort of combination is intriguing. It's fresh, so I appreciate that. I thought that worked really well. Also, stank. Stank's just such a good word. Like that just stank. Good stuff. Good word choices. Intriguing word choices. Wheelbarrow, very physical, also very concrete. The antlers, and again, just the violence we mentioned earlier was shot. There's a lot of words here that are doing a lot of work, I feel, in terms of just grounding your reader. And stank in a way that made the dogs howl. Okay. So we're tying in some sound, tying in some visual. Other things going on. Stank in a way that made the dogs howl. Interesting with dogs too, because we don't know whose dogs. Speaker's dogs, the neighbor's dogs. First instinct is kind of the speaker's dogs, but that's kind of interesting if it's the neighbor's dogs, because it's like the neighbor putting their own animals through this torture. In rot, it sat for weeks, enthroned in darkened soil. Okay, so we have the sense of enthroning, so we're applying some like royalty or regalness to this rot, which is interesting. There's this respect and reverence. Darkened soil kind of to me implies richness. I'm thinking almost farm, but at least something like kind of nutrient. Could also just be maybe it was like wet. I like the also just going back to the I like the shift. It stands out and stank in a way that made the dogs howl. Long line and rot it sat for weeks. You just said da 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 da. You just got your iams that go pretty heavy, so that kind of rhythm shift, adding some contrast. Enthroned in darkened soil. Enthroned in darkened soil. So again, we're kind of getting back to those that iam ribbon as well. It stared, and then we break that a little bit. Stared through the fence. Stared through the fence. We broke the rhythm. In rot, it sat for weeks. Interesting also with sat. So the head sat and wheelbarrow, and rot, it sat for weeks. So same word choice. And rot sat for weeks enthroned in darkened soil. It stared through the fence. What I'm looking at right now is I'm looking at agency, seeing what does this head have control over. So it has control over its positioning. It has control over its sits. It's stank. That almost implies again it has control over the smell. It's casting. It's that, and then it's stared. So we're seeing a lot. We are seeing some agency on behalf of this head, but it's almost like kind of like passive agency, right? It's just sitting and staring. It stares through the fence at a world that stood idle, while dead like me crept by. So that's now again we're getting kind of weird again, and there's some irony here, right? So you have the head that's dead, although in some of the things that we're doing, we're almost kind of making it alive. Versus while dead like me crept by. So now the speaker's dead. It's like, wait, what? What just happened? So that kind of a version of like the head that's dead becoming a living thing, and then the speaker that's living becoming dead. I want to also kind of just dig into this a little more. At a world that stood idle, so the world's not moving, but the dead creep by, and the speaker creeps by, or so it seems. It's interesting that because I think a lot of times when you think about it, you hear about how the world moves on even when we want to be still or we try to be still. But this is kind of an inversion on that. It's the world that's now standing still while we keep going on. Stare through the fence. Also, so I feel like also just it stared through the fence. So this is the first mention of a barrier. Hard. We don't have a whole lot of information about, but it feels almost like a barrier between the speaker and the neighbor. It's interesting too that the neighbor in some ways has become. I guess there's the fence up here as well. The speaker and the neighbor, and in some ways the neighbor that shot the deer. The neighbor also kind of becomes this head. It's also kind of a neighbor of sorts. Stare through the fence at a world that stood idle. So it is idle. The world is idle. And then I'm dead. The speaker is dead. Also with crept. So kind of insinuating some slow movements. It's interesting too that this is happening right in the middle of this sequence here. These lines are all about the same length, right? How many lines are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? So very even. So it's happening right around line 5. So this whole sequence is moving slow. And this line here is also kind of reinforcing that to a degree. But then that kind of breaks though. So then there's kind of this irony, this ironic tension that we get some sudden movement here, even though we're still in that kind of slow down movement, similar line length. So I feel like that's kind of also adding a little bit of tension there. Then the skull was gone. Is that our turn? It's almost 2 on the nose, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Is that like line 8? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I'm counting horribly. So a little bit past the halfway mark. Then the skull was gone. No, that's not the turn. This is the turn. I would argue this is your turn. Because this is the first time we get celestial, we get more abstract. We've been grounded this entire time. shooting the deer, the hanging of the antlers, or the desire to, the head in the wheelbarrow, the stench, the rot, the soil, the staring through the fence, the world. Dead creeping by, but still kind of in that world. Skull was gone. And this is also the first moment we have uncertainty. So this line here is doing a lot of things differently. We have introduced a whole new concept. We've introduced the abstract, the celestial, the heaven. And we've also introduced a speaker who suddenly is uncertain. Whereas everything else to this point has been very, very decisive. So that's the argument I would make, that this line is probably your turn. There's some tonal things happening here that are different. You guys can let me know, where do you see the turn happening? And we don't go into it more. The skull is gone, perhaps taken by heaven. We don't try to explain why or try to guess why. We're just like, must have been taken by heaven. The religiosity of this. We don't even know entirely how religious the speaker is. Then, again, interesting repetition. Then perhaps. It's kind of another, again, suggestion that this is where the turn is, just because the stylistic, we haven't had those sorts of repetitions. I don't count the sat from earlier. Then the wheelbarrow, perhaps taken for work in some fruitful garden. So this is, again, it's doing some similar type of work. Taken by heaven, followed by the fruitful garden down here. So, I mean, I feel like you're kind of naturally led to Eden. Perhaps taken by heaven. Then the wheelbarrow, perhaps taken for work. That's an interesting phrase too, taken for, in terms of like the reason why it was removed or taken, but also taken for meaning like mistaken for. As in the wheelbarrow was mistaken for doing work when you actually weren't doing work in the garden. Which again kind of also implies that does go back to the Genesis story, like the deception, like the acting that you're doing the right work, you're doing the right thing when you're not. Which again, in a poem about death, the banishment kind of comes in there too. Anyways, perhaps taken for work in some fruitful garden, but it could also just be literally, hey, we took it to some garden. We haven't had any mention about the garden before. We don't even know if this neighbor has a garden. We don't even know if this wheelbarrow belongs to the neighbor. The questions of ownership are really interesting. Because this head and things like that is never actually even really claimed in a way. It's always like the head, its antlers, the dogs. We don't know who owns the dogs. We don't know whose soil it is. We don't know whose fence it is. We don't even know whose world it is. It's the skull again. It's the wheelbarrow again. Some fruit. There's this. I don't want to say fear. There's this avoidance of ownership, which is really interesting because we begin with an action that's very decisive. Like my neighbor shot a deer. This is the one time where we're like super complicit. That's probably the strongest action in the poem. Seeing a comment here, honestly, I hadn't thought of the eating connection, but I'm not surprised that came out subconsciously. It's tricky. Again, I could totally just be dragging things in here that aren't intended. But I feel like, you make a mention of heaven and then you make a mention of a fruitful garden a couple lines later. It's like, well, maybe, maybe we're doing it. Maybe we're there. Anyways, perhaps taken for work in some fruitful garden. All that is left is the dirt. And again, that also kind of goes back to like the Eden, the banishment from the garden is like it may not be intentional, but I feel like once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's there's a lot kind of going on in terms of the religious work and imagery. Um, so some things that kind of just stand out to me, and I don't necessarily have answers. It's just kind of things I think are interesting. Going back again to the ownership, how aside from the Maya of the neighbor, there's not really a lot. In fact, there's the opposite of ownership. There's a lot of distancing, like intentional trying to stay away from owning the thing. I'm really curious about the dead like me. About what am I supposed to interpret this as the speaker actually being dead? You know, or is it just I don't know entirely what to make of that at the moment. That kind of inversion. So it's interesting too. So it seems like for the most part the poem's functioning grammatically. Right? My neighbor shot a deer, sought to hang his anglers. That's the sentence. Had sat in a wheelbarrow by a fence, snake away. Cool. And ride it sat for weeks. It stared through the fence. Then the skull was gone. Then the wheelbarrow. So this is the one time. This is the one sentence that grammatically is not really a sentence, right? Because there's no verb. There's no independent clause. So that's kind of interesting that we break there. The other thing too is I don't. So the speaker's noticing all these things, and it's intriguing. How does the speaker feel about this? Like, so I guess the question I'm kind of asking myself is, okay, so I think there's a lot of heavy imageries and things like that, um, but the emotional, and this kind of ties into the possession too. Like, there's a lot of distance. There's distance, and yet there's also a lot of attention to detail. So it's like where I'm not going to become emotionally attached to the things I'm going to observe with very astute detail. And so that's also kind of a tension that's going on as well. And this actually kind of speaks to it. So Dream Splunker writes, the dead like me was a reflection of the depression I was going through at the time. Like I didn't feel much different than the deadhead. Yeah, I mean, I think that comes through. I mean, it's a very striking line. I think that's the impression that the line gives off. So I think it's doing that work. And I think that also hints at those things that I just mentioned too, that we're paying attention to this world and yet we're not attaching ourselves to it at the same time. There's a passiveness in the sense of the speaker. The only thing the speaker claims is the neighbor, a neighbor who also promptly disappears. So what would we make of that the neighbor is not even, so the neighbors seems to be only here to explain why did we have this head. So I think something that this piece kind of leaves me with is I'm not entirely sure of the emotion I'm supposed to leave the poem with. And so that makes it tricky when I'm trying to reread it again. And like reread it several times. I think you mentioned kind of the depression aspect, which again I do think is this the only moment where we really get the interior, like this is probably the moment where we get the deepest interiority into the speaker, right? There's some subtle things, by paying attention to the details the speaker notices, we can get some ideas, but this is probably the closest thing. So if we keep that in mind, so we have a speaker that feels dead. That's witnessing death. How did they feel about an animal actually dying? And then the sought to hang it. That's also a really interesting line too, because now we're explaining motivations, and this is a poem that doesn't seem to want to explore motivations. It's not exploring why the speaker feels dead. It's not exploring why heaven would take it. It's not exploring why someone would take this for work in the garden. And then you have a speaker that the only thing that they are left to notice is the dirt. There's not even a neighbor. The neighbor's also gone. What do we make of the neighbor disappearing? Never shot here. Some ways, it's kind of like the most adamant thing. Like the speaker's very adamant. I did not shoot this deer. It was my neighbor. My neighbor shot a deer. Yeah. Not something I have immediate answers for. But lots of intriguing thoughts. Dream Splunker, I'll hang on for a couple minutes. Let me know. Are there things that you have questions about? Things that you're like, Jeff, you're wild and crazy. Like that Nickelodeon show about kids from like the 90s. I enjoyed the read. There's a lot here. It's very clean. And they mentioned I personally could never shoot a deer. That's fair. I personally would not want to do that myself. Not gonna lie. I feel that. Cool. All right, guys, let me know your thoughts on this. If you want to take a stab at some questions that I have about the poem. Where's the neighbor go? How do you think the speaker feels at the end of the poem? And other things that kind of just generally stand out to you about this poem. Do you guys see that religious imagery? Am I crazy in thinking that? Okay. Dream Swanker also notes this was based on a real observations. There's some real observations I had of a rotting deer head in a neighbor's yard. Oh, I imagine this was real. It's a little bit too strange to just make up. I imagine it came from a real sort of situation. Yeah, I mean, I think there is kind of like a emptiness in a way on the part of the speaker. It's interesting that it also is, so this is a poem that's been super observational. And then to say at the end, all that's left is the dirt. Do you buy that from the speaker? Do you buy that the only thing is the only thing is the dirt that's left? They also note that they kind of just let it sit there and stink for a while. Well, that's nice of them. some courteous neighbors. News Logger has a question. Why did you pick this one out of 3? Good question. One, I thought it was a poem that we could do justice to. Let's given the time. Like for instance, that second was just a little long, and I forget what the other page was. Oh, those just kept going. Yeah, I think one of the biggest things was just from a time perspective. I want to make sure we can try to do pieces justice in relatively short time frames. And then 2, I mean, there's so much here. I think it captures that single moment really well. So I think there's a lot of things to think about in terms of craft with regards to titling, with regards to line lengths, with regards to ironies, with regards to even rhythm. We mentioned some I am things going on. So those are kind of the things that stood out to me. I'm sorry if you wanted me to do a different one. Maybe in the future, we can take a look at another one. But yeah, but those are the things that kind of stood out. Hang around just for another couple minutes in case you have another question or something I can try to answer. I feel like rhythmically it's really interesting. The first three lines, um, almost feels like first three lines really know they're doing stage setting and really kind of want to squeeze it in. They make a note. Most people say it's their favorite out of those three. Why could that be? Personally attached to the potential self one. They do mention there. That you picked it. Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you. I just want to take a look at that potential self. Don't quite have time to do analysis, but just to kind of read through it really quick. To my potential self, you are not lodged inside me, a pebbled, a seed, a speckled bean. While I lay in the night, you stir like most gestating things. I wake to your kicks and dig for you like a yard mad dog. That's a nice description. Sniffing and restless, knowing you're there. Oh, magic bean, will you grow in the moonlight? Will you fasten your terrible vine to my spine and crawl up my throat? Perhaps you'll flower. Perhaps you'll burst with fruit. Perhaps you'll crack open my skull like a magic pumpkin as you climb to reach those mighty clouds. I strove to disavow you once. I tried to quell your gas for the sun with cold denial and a numb shot of bourbon. But now I water you, curious and warm, here in my lonely covers where darkness incubates all hereafters. I see your leaves in full flourish. I see you face the world with your adventurous yens, falling in love with that vast expanse bubbling in the sun. Perhaps you deserve it more than I do. When they find me in the morning, this bed will be yours, the sheets filled with soil. They will crane their necks to see, through the hole in the ceiling, you, the cartwheeling bean plant in the sky. They won't look at their feet to see where your roots spread, but will stand without mourning, utterly in awe at the linen lined grave for who I used to be. Hmm. Potential self. Almost feels like a pregnancy poem. Um, one thing to kind of contrast this in the deer one. The deer one is just I feel like very grounded in the moment. So I'm wondering if when when you say most people view it as their favorite, I'm wondering if they're liking that kind of grounding aspect, the single moment, you know, where we're just hanging there the entire time. There is some travel, there is some time travel going on, but in general, it's really encapsulated. This one here starts off a lot more abstract. And I wonder if that's so. It takes a moment longer to establish a connection. I feel on the entry. It's not to say like it's better or worse. It's just different, right? So that's kind of what's standing out to me. Although interesting, this one's also a little bit more direct with the emotional appeals. Like for instance, like I strove to disavow you, I tried to quell. Like we're seeing a speaker that's become a lot more vulnerable in this one. Yeah. To make a note here, that's what I think too. A lot of my poetry tends to be very high concept and fanciful. Dear to Dir is very different. Oh, that's very interesting. I have again, I make this illusion a lot. I forget who originally said. I need to find it because I quote it all the time. But again, like when you enter a poem, it's like stepping into a boat because you just don't know what this that poem's going to hold you up. You don't know where it's going to take you. You don't know if it's safe. You just have a lot of questions when you're starting a new piece. And I think in a lot of ways, the deer poem feels safer at the start. I said thank you for reading. Of course, thank you for sharing. It's good stuff. Congratulations again on the publications and things. All right, guys. If you have other thoughts for me or for Dream Spelunker, we would love to hear it. You can leave them in the comments. We'll be checking them, of course, from now on into the future. Once again, my name is Jeff. You've been watching Fine Print. Fine Print is our show. Just to remind you, every single Sunday at this time, 9 p.m., take a look at poems that you have published. And if you're interested in sending us a poem that you have had published somewhere, what you can do is you can find us if you search either just diversuspoetry.com. Give me a moment and I can show you what that looks like. Okay. Diversuspoetry.com. This is our home base. Okay, this is what it looks like. Scroll down to the bottom. There's a contact page. So if you don't want to send us a message with the poem, you don't want to tag us on a post on social media, that's fine. The easy way to do that would be through Threads. We use Threads the most, but you can also send on Instagram or Facebook. Or you can also just kind of reach out through this contact page. That will get us to our email. So we'd love to look at your poems. If you have a poem that's not published, we'd be happy to look at that as well, to give some feedback in case you're looking to kind of see what's working, what's not working. I don't personally count this as publication. I know some publications do, but I won't call that attention to them. Just make some radical revisions. They don't have to know. It can be our secret. Be like, oh my gosh. But yes, once more, my name is Jeff. Take a note of all the things we're doing. We launched our first poetry journal as well, which you can find at diversitypoetry.com, called The Collective. Thanks again to Dream Spelunker for sharing their wonderful work with us. It was a joy to read, and we'll see you around on the socials like Threads. You guys have a good day, have a good night, good afternoon, and take care. We'll see you next time.